G'day, it's Time Poor Dad here. You know what? I thought I'd wanted to share a little bit of a story about comic books. I always loved comic books. I collected them from the news agency in the mid-90s. I was obsessed with X-Men. And it was probably a bit of the transition from, liking things like He-Man and Transformers and toys and developing more, teenage interests. So I would have been in about the 7th grade when I started collecting X-Men comics. And I started, trying to work out who else in high school was into it. And there was a few other kids. One of them was a guy called Gomez. His last name was actually Montgomery, but we called him Gomez for short. And he was also into comics. But there was a bit of a difference. You see, I was a bit of a reader, but he was a real collector and a somewhat investor. He used to love Wizard magazine and he'd look up the prices of all the different comics. Me, I just enjoyed the stories. I remember, I traded my very first comic book. It was a What If Rogue possessed the power of Thor? And I traded that for Legion Quest Part 1, which was Uncanny X-Men 320, I believe. I've still got that one. Well, after a couple of years, my friend Gomez, he just, grew out of comics and he got into music. He had a bit of a Beatles obsession. He collected all the LPs and the vinyl, and he had the idea of starting a band. Only problem was he didn't have a guitar, and so he needed one. And so what he did was he bundled all his comic books together and he'd added up all the different prices. He'd looked up Wizard magazine and he was convinced that he was sitting on hundreds, maybe even over $1,000 worth of comics. And so he headed down to a collector's fair. Where we lived, there was this collector's fair in a place called Parramatta. And yeah, he'd taken me down there a few times before and they had, used action figures, movie memorabilia. I got myself How Geeky Is This, a Films of John Wayne book. And so he went down with a buddy of mine called Daniel and he was going to sell his big box of comic books and he was going to go buy himself a guitar. And so they get to the collector's fair and they go to one of the vendors and he says, just leave the box with me, come back in an hour and I'll take a look through them. And so Gomez and Dan, they head into the mall and they start looking around the music shops. And Gomez is talking about all the amazing things he's going to buy. He's looking at these fancy electric guitars and, he's already counting the money. And so about an hour or so later, they head back to the collector fair and they go over to the guy at the booth and he says, how much will you give him for me? And he says, $50. Well, Gomez stops for a second and he says, for the top one? Well, the guy says, no, for the whole box. Oh, poor Gomez, he goes bright red, looks like he's almost about to cry. So much for the dream. He takes his box with him, he doesn't sell them, and he heads home. And I think that's a bit of a lesson for all of us. You buy comics because you love them, because you love the stories, and you're never going to get what you expect for them. If you can enjoy the story, that's great. You're always going to pay more if you want it than if you sell. And so, you know what? My collecting has always been about the fun of it, and I think that's the way it should be. I don't think collecting should ever be an investment. It's not an investment. It's only an investment in your entertainment. Well, that's all I've got to say about this. Time for Dad out. Bye.